This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the University of South Australia meets on the land of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Hawke Centre, the University of South Australia and The Conversation to our event Borders and the Pandemic. I'm thrilled that we are co-presenting this timely online series with The Conversation, and I would like to thank editor Misha Kachel and Susan Hornbeck, Strategic Partnerships Manager, for their wonderful work. Also to thank our speakers for their contribution and for sharing their unique insight and experience in tonight's discussion. I warmly welcome back Professor Hugh White and Professor Stan Grant, who have previously presented for the Hawke Centre. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not join us online. I'm sure you will find tonight's presentation thought-provoking and insightful, and it's now my pleasure to welcome Paul Barclay from ABC Big Ideas to introduce our guest speakers.
It's a pleasure to be here on Zoom. Hello and welcome. Thanks to the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre at the University of South Australia and to The Conversation for setting up this discussion. Coronavirus, as you are all well aware, has shut international borders, forced countries to isolate from their neighbouring countries, brought an end to the global mobility with which we've become accustomed and put globalism itself into reverse. The world seemed a smallish place only 4 months ago, whereas now it's scarcely possible to travel between Sydney and Melbourne. There's been profound geopolitical disruption as well. We're seeing heightened tensions between nation states as a result of COVID-19, the manifest failure to control the pandemic by the world's wealthiest nation, and vast economic carnage and instability. None of this obviously is good for global security, and yet we are only at the beginning of the pandemic and its impact. What happens to a world that has suddenly become smaller and more compartmentalised? Has the pandemic made the world a more dangerous place in more ways than one? And how do we prevent a rise in xenophobia and isolationism and a lurch, perhaps, towards Cold War conflict? Some of the questions we'll be talking about today with our very impressive panel of speakers. We are joined by Hugh White, Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU, Professor Stan Grant, a journalist and Vice-Chancellor's Chair of Australian Indigenous Belonging at Charles Sturt University, and Dennis Altman, Professorial Fellow in Human Security at the Institute for Human Security at La Trobe University. Welcome to you all. Stan, I'll come to you first of all. There were, of course, signs of countries looking inward, turning away from globalism before COVID-19. We had Brexit, of course, in the UK and the US starting to lean into isolationism. How much, though, has COVID-19 and the closure of borders accelerated this trend?
It has accelerated the trend. You know, it puts me in mind of something that the German jurist and philosopher and Nazi for a period as well, Carl Schmitt, once said. He said that sovereign is he who defines the exception. I think emergency, exceptional circumstances allow the imposition of laws that constrain our liberty, that increase surveillance, that lock us down. When you have defined the exception, when you declare the emergency, you centralise that power. And I think that's what we've seen around the world. And it predates coronavirus, of course. You can go back to the 9/11 attacks and the response to that, the sense that this was a war of civilization, you're with us or you're against us, that it opened the door again for greater surveillance, greater control over people's liberties. And we've seen that with coronavirus. So I think those tensions that had existed in our world between authoritarianism, the rise of China, the erosion of democracy, the erosion of freedoms, a rise of a political populism, the beginnings of a more virulent nationalism, borders going back up, a blowback against immigration, trade tensions, particularly between the United States and China, all of those things were in play. Coronavirus has focused our minds on this and has accelerated a lot of those issues. You can see now where the fault lines are and where they're widening.
Hugh, how much do you see COVID-19 as tempering globalism?
Well, I think, as is so often the case, Paul, when we see these very short, sharp events like COVID, or for that matter, like 9/11, the really big impacts they have are the way in which they amplify and accelerate the deeper pre-existing trends. And I think, the big story for us is that a whole lot of factors, strategic and economic, were driving us away from the vision of a unified, globalised world under US leadership, which had sort of become the orthodoxy in the 1990s and had struggled on through the first decade of this century. But that was under a lot of pressure anyway. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has just taken that and amplified it and accelerated it. And we can see this at work, for example, in the all-important relationship between America and China. On both sides of the Pacific, the political imperatives in Beijing and in Washington to demonize the other, the benefits that both sides can reap by trying to blame the other side for what's going wrong, have just made what was already a very sharply escalating adversarial relationship that much sharper and that much more dangerous. And I think when the historians look back, they'll see that the really big impact of COVID in a geostrategic space was the way it, as I say, amplified and accelerated those pre-existing trends, but in a very dangerous way, producing, I think, a very dangerous moment.
Yeah, so Dennis, obviously this has been brewing for some time, this kind of move away from globalism, but what are the dangers, as you see it, of nations looking increasingly inwards, perhaps surging nationalism and so on? Do you think we are retreating into our own national bubbles more than ever?
Well, I think clearly more than ever, because we're forced into it. And I'm concerned about what the long-term psychological impact of the virtual end of international travel is. And we have now a generation of Australians who've got used to the idea that you can in effect be a global citizen, that you can move around the world easily, that you can find work. We, of course, have had a constant inflow of very large migration numbers. That's all ended very abruptly because of the epidemic. And I think it'll take a long time for the full impact of that to hit us. And I've been very struck by the fact that political rhetoric has fallen back on the one hand, a very simplistic Cold War picture that seems to assume that the tensions that Stan and Hugh have talked about between China and the US is just a replay of the Cold War, but with a different enemy. On the other hand, what struck me is there have been some protests led by the Greens and Get Up about the vastly increase in spending on defence. In those disagreements, I haven't seen anybody talk about the fact that over the last decade, we have consistently, since the Rudd period, consistently cut back on overseas development assistance. And I'm struck by how the rhetoric that's attacking the government for its defence expenditure doesn't seem to be thinking at all about what we might be doing in a different way to missiles to enhance Australia's security through things like foreign assistance and indeed through a proper set of policies on climate change, which we know would be being told year after year by the Pacific Islands that is effectively what they really want Australia to do to contribute to their security.
I want to pick up on, I mean, there are so many things you said there, Dennis, that are worth picking up on. But that point you made before about how we'd all become used to being able to move around the world freely, the cultural interactions that resulted from that, the increased cultural understandings, I suppose, that resulted from that. That's all stopped now. I mean, a number of the people on this panel are academics or people with affiliations with universities. Stan is an extremely well-travelled journalist. I mean, we've all been so used to the world being our venue. That is no longer the case and might not be the case potentially for years to come. Mm-hmm. What, Dennis, do you think is, I mean, what happens with this level of international disruption? I mean, how do we change as a result of that?
I don't think we know. I mean, we haven't actually had any previous experience because there is no time in recent history when, however intense conflicts were, we were unable to travel. I mean, I'm speaking to you guys from Melbourne. I literally am forbidden to go and visit anybody else on this panel at the moment. And if we think about what that means, and we extend it to a global picture where we see the virtual collapse of airline after airline, we see the end of large-scale immigration, which has been a very important factor in the ongoing economic success of this country. I think, therefore, there are a whole set of both psychological and political repercussions that will play out over the next decade. And you know, Paul, I have a bad record as a political pastor. I am good at miscalling elections. So I'm not going to try and call the future when, in fact, I don't think we have any model to look back on that will tell us this is going to play out.
Yeah. Yeah, Stan, the two countries with which Australia has its most important relationships have both been hit very hard by the pandemic, China and the United States. Which of those two countries has been weakened the most by coronavirus, do you think?
I would say the United States, notwithstanding the fact that China had entered the coronavirus crisis with an already weakening economy, and there are fault lines, there are cracks within China, whether it be the Hong Kong protests, whether it be coronavirus, a slowing economy, tensions with Taiwan, all of those things certainly are there. But those issues notwithstanding, if you look at the United States, what are you looking at? You're looking at a country that has endured 20 plus years of unending crisis. You look at the attacks on 9/11, the endless wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, the loss of blood and treasure, the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. You have a country now in the United States that is so politically polarized, a president who has claimed power not by seeking to unite a country, but to play on those divisions. You have a country that in many respects is ungovernable. One of the things, of course, we know about democracies is that it relies on the consent of the loser, the consent of the minority. Well, you have vast swathes of America that will not accept the result of elections. You know, if you look at the Obama election and the way the Republicans absolutely set forth from that moment on, as Mitch McConnell said, to destroy that presidency. The questions of legitimacy about Obama. When Trump was elected, the Democrats immediately taking to the streets to protest the legitimacy of that presidency. Donald Trump clearly in election mode now, playing to divisions along racial lines. You have a country that is wounded, a country that has lost prestige, a country that is poorer, and a country that is much more divided. And I think it raises just quickly something that I think is a fundamental question of our age, and that is, do liberal democracies hit their limits a lot sooner than authoritarian regimes? To the extent that China is rewriting the rule book, that China's authoritarian capitalism is able to increase the wealth of a country while not becoming more free, to become rich but not become free, set against an America that is reaching the limits of democracy in its ability to govern over difference, to govern over division, to deal with the unreconciled aspects of its history, and to be prone to the type of political populism that we're seeing in the Trump presidency. So on balance, I would say the United States is weakened. But of course, that's not to say that China does not have its own issues, and a change at the next election may in fact be a circuit breaker for the United States. But right now, on balance, I would say it's the United States that has suffered more greatly.
And the other thing, Hugh, the coronavirus has exposed the United States as being unable to respond coherently to this major challenge that the pandemic poses. I mean, the death toll in the US is enormous and rising rapidly every day. What does the failure of the United States to control the spread of this pandemic tell us about the demise of the US as a global leader? I mean, does in some ways this encapsulate the end of US exceptionalism in a way? Because it's just gone completely off the rails in the US. There's no sense that large swathes of the public are even listening to advice from certain levels of government.
Yes, Paul, I think I think you're right. The US failure to deal with the pandemic effectively is itself an enormously significant thing. And I think there are three aspects of it that's worth thinking about in that regard. The first is that it draws our attention to what one might call the technical deficiencies of the US system of government. We've all got used to thinking that the US system of government was, although massive and cumbersome and all the rest of it, in the end very effective. You know, it got a man on the moon, that sort of stuff. But this just looks like sheer incompetence. Cyclone Katrina writ large. And so the collapse in confidence that the US system can actually deliver good outcomes is very critical. The second factor, I think, is the collapse of morale domestically at home in the United States. The United States at the moment is gearing itself up to a new Cold War, as the phrase is, with the most formidable adversary it's ever confronted in China. And to do that, it's going to have immense reserves of strength and resolve, not just within its political class, but within its entire population. Whereas I think what we're seeing here, and it goes back to a point Stan was making, that the US voter, the US citizen, has copped a lot in the last couple of decades after the extraordinary optimism of the 1990s, when the Cold War had been won, America's economy appeared to be on top of the world. We've now had these 20 years of very disappointing outcomes, strategic, political, economic, social as well. And I think, the recent upsurge of Black Lives Matter fury really is a very important additional element to this. All of these things mean that we're seeing a United States which no longer has the inner reserves of will, which were required back in the old Cold War to marshal the US effort against the Soviet Union. I think makes it very doubtful it's going to play that same kind of role this time around. And the third thing, of course, is its reputation. That is one of the reasons why America won the first Cold War, was because the rest of the world could see that even though there were things that America did wrong, and even though it went through some terrible times with Watergate and Vietnam and so on, there was still a respect or a fear of America in other parts of the world. Today, as the rest of the world sees America floundering, sees this great country with a health system which just does not work, and a political system which simply cannot effectively address problems which really ought to be dealt with, it's very hard for America to project itself to other countries, both to its adversaries and to those whose support it seeks, the image of a country that can lead. And so across all of those three things, I think people are going to look back at the pandemic and see that this is a moment in which America's credentials and its capabilities to lead the kind of global campaign that it's talking about leading were really undermined.
Paul, can I just add a caveat to that, because it does appear to be a very pessimistic view that Hugh and I have put forward. If I look at China and the United States, though, what I do see is the greater capacity still within the United States for renewal, whereas China has authoritarianism. That's what it has. Its response is an authoritarian response. Weakened United States, yes, undoubtedly, but I do err on the side that potentially is greater renewal than I would see necessarily for China.
Because democracy has the capacity to renew leadership, to bring new ideas to bear and so forth.
It does, but democracy itself right now also is in retreat. Freedom House now measures 13 straight years of declining democracy and freedom around the world. And unlike the previous Cold War, China represents a viable alternative in that it is getting rich without getting free. It's embracing aspects of market capitalism that suit it, but at the same time rejecting any idea of Western universalism or human rights. It's rewriting the rule book to that extent. So all of this is with the heavy caveat that right now an authoritarian China is a viable model that others seek to copy at a time when democracy is weakening and the great beacon of democracy is in tatters. But does it still have the capacity for greater renewal, as someone like de Tocqueville would have said? Democracy may look weak on the surface, underneath it's still doing a lot of work.
Well, I'd like to get your response to that, Dennis.
Yes, I actually wanted to pick up Stan earlier because I think Stan, you was sort of said the polarisation in the United States is equal. I think the reality is that it's the Republicans who have consistently been unwilling to accept defeat. Let's remember that in the last 20 years, 2 Democrats, Al Gore and Hillary Clinton, actually won the popular vote and accepted the Electoral College system, accepted instantly that they had lost the election. So I think we have to be careful because there is a tendency to want to paint what's going on in the US as a battle between 2 polarising forces, rather than to see, I think, the very sad reality that the Republican Party has been captured by a narcissistic crazy. And that's a polite way of describing the current president. But having said that, Stan, I think I agree with you. I think the United States has potential to re-energise. I think a lot depends on not just Joe Biden winning the election, but the Democrats winning control of both houses of Congress. And I think there has to be, for the possibility of a stronger United States, a very clear-cut win by the Democrats. A narrow victory would, I think, lead to such accusations by Trump and his supporters that the election somehow had been stolen, that the deep state had undermined him, that the swamp had somehow risen and brought with it a Joe Biden presidency, that I see that as very dangerous. So I agree with you, Stan, but I think it really does depend upon a very major shift in voting in November.
Hugh, I think you wanted to say something earlier, is that right?
Yes, really, and it picks up the point that Dennis was making as well, and that is that I share Stan's point that America still has enormous capacity for renewal and reinvigoration. And I don't for a moment write the United States off as an immensely powerful and significant country. But I don't think we should look forward to a world in which America regains the kind of role that we all hoped and expected it to play back in the optimistic 1990s. The idea of a US-led global order.
This is because it doesn't want to have that role anymore.
It's because it doesn't want it, and it's also because it doesn't have the power to do so. The old idea presupposed that America would remain just unchallengeably the most powerful country in the world. And what we've all taken a long time to really come to terms with is that China is now, on the most significant measures, a more powerful country than the United States. It's got a bigger economy, and it's becoming increasingly creative, technologically, and so on. Of course, it has its political problems and so on, but I think we'd be too optimistic to imagine that China is not going to continue to grow to the point where the United States really cannot play the role we wanted it to play. So don't write the United States off, but don't imagine we can go back to a US-led global order of the kind that was conjured up under the Clinton presidency. And I might say I don't think the outcome of this year's election is all that significant in that. Obviously, you'd much rather have President Biden than President Trump, but I think Biden himself is a pretty weak character. I don't see any signs that he has a real clear vision for American leadership. I think his capacity to mobilize America to the effort that will be required to see off China's challenge in Asia is very low. And, of course, his chances of sustaining control of the Congress, the way the US system works, is pretty minimal. So I don't think we should be too optimistic about where America can take us in future.
Let's come back to Australia and our relationship with these 2 giants, and let's talk about China first of all. Hugh, you think the Australia-China relationship is at possibly its lowest ebb since Whitlam recognised China in the 1970s. Can you talk to that for a moment?
Well, I think, the relationship with China begun by Whitlam, amplified enormously by Hawke and Keating, and then, to be fair to him, picked up by Howard and turned into a real engine for the Australian economy. But it's worth remembering that the strategic foundation, the politico-strategic foundation of the economic relationship we have built with China was a promise that John Howard made to Jiang Zemin back in 1996, which was that Australia would remain a strong US ally, but that nothing we did as a US ally would be directed against China. Now, that was an easy promise to make and an easy promise to keep when America didn't see China as a strategic rival. But ever since about 2008 or 2009, as the strategic rivalry has grown, and much more sharply still since about 2017, and even more sharply in the last few months, the rivalry between the US and China has escalated. America has increasingly sought Australia's support in confronting China and resisting China's ambitions. And the Chinese have started to call us out on that and say, no, that's not the promise you guys made. So I think it's a mistake to look at the problems we're having at the moment as just being related to what Scott Morrison said about the World Health Organization inquiry or whether we've banned Huawei from 5G. I mean, these are not insignificant, but there's something much deeper going on. China has a vision of the future regional order and its role in it, which Australia regards as inconsistent with its interests. And if we we are turning to the United States, hoping the United States will push back to China, and the Chinese don't like that. So we've got very deep questions to ask about where this is going to go.
And Stan, this of course brings up, and I know it's a hackneyed question, but it really brings up this issue of is Australia at that point of having to choose between China and the United States?
And it's always been a fallacy, this idea that we do not have to choose. And making choices doesn't mean making the same choice all the time. It's not just a zero-sum game. You're not all in one and all against the other. We are in a situation where we have to manage our economic relationship with China, and we are in a situation where our security guarantee and our closest relationship and our values align with the United States. But Hugh's right. The United States is not the country that it was 10 years, 20 years ago. The question of US hegemony and American prestige abroad, and the questions of the United States staying the course are still to be answered. We've already seen Trump pull out of things such as the Paris Accord, push back against NATO, raise questions about America's role in the world. That predates Trump, by the way. Obama had also said that it wasn't America's job to be the policeman. It also lectured the US, Australia and others about pulling their weight when it comes to military spending. So there are questions about how, that relationship. But I would also caution, I don't automatically buy the idea of the uninterrupted trajectory of China's rise either. I mean, China, as we see with what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen being returned with a much stronger vote, a much stronger majority, a growing independence push there. There are fault lines everywhere in China. Xi Jinping's idea of harmony means harmonizing the country by force, locking up dissidents, locking up the likes of ethnic Uyghur Muslims, continuing the crackdown in Tibet. And China has its own demographic time bomb to deal with. By 2029, China starts losing population. It becomes an older country. An older country is not as wealthy as it once was. Its productivity potentially will decline. It's going to have to be able to pay for an aging country. So all of this lies ahead. And I think this plays very much into Xi Jinping's mind. I think there is a bit of a rush now with Xi Jinping to get a lot of things done before he hits that point. To claim the South China Sea, to bring Hong Kong under mainland China rule, to sort out the questions of Taiwanese independence, to get the Belt and Road Initiative established and embedded, part of declaring himself, this quasi-president for life, is to achieve those things before they hit that point. So China has its own issues to deal with.
I mean, they're massive issues for a country like Australia to deal with, a country that is part of the West and that sides with the rules-based international order. I mean, Dennis, if there's one thing this pandemic has done perhaps more than anything else geopolitically is focus on some real fractures between the Australian-Chinese relationship. How are you seeing that relationship at the moment, and what would you like to say about where you see that heading?
Well, listen to Hugh and Stan. Two things occur to me. Firstly, this terrible tendency in Australia to talk as if somehow there were only two countries in the world, There are, in fact, a number of other significant players in Asia. I think that increasingly we need to have much more complex and detailed relationships. And this gets, down to things like the fact that Australia is notorious spending in its diplomatic efforts, that we have a smaller footprint diplomatically than other countries. In fact, there are many countries with a lesser GDP than we have. But if you look at the way in which other countries in the region, from Japan through Indonesia through to India, are responding to China, the picture becomes a lot more complex. And the other thing that occurred to me was we talk about the security guarantee as if we were back in the 1940s and somehow submarines and aircraft are going to come and bomb Darwin. Now, I don't think anybody seriously thinks that is the threat. There are all sorts of threats. I'm not denying that there are threats, and I'm not denying that China clearly wants to have regional and maybe semi-global dominance. But I think the nature of the threats are very different. And what we need is a sensible discussion about what those threats are. And I find it interesting, we've lived through this year that major set of bushfires followed by the epidemic. If anything, underlined the fact that threats to national security are not the traditional military threats. Surely we should have learnt that. And I find it really ironic in the middle of this, in response to this, and maybe because Scott Morrison thought it would bring in 3 more votes in Queanbeyan for the Eden-Monaro by-election, we announced we're going to spend billions more money on missiles. Now, maybe we need the missiles, but I'm not sure we need the missiles as much as we need a sensible, thought-through approach to strengthening the global institutions around things like climate change, around things like responding to epidemics, where clearly we as a small, at best middle-level power have a huge stake, a much greater stake than the US will ever have in some sort of functioning global order.
Yeah, Hugh, would you like to respond to that? I mean, it is an interesting point that Dennis makes about conflict with China. I mean, it does tend to conjure up old-fashioned images of war and the yellow peril heading toward Australia. But is he right that when we think of conflict, it's a different type of conflict and it's a different type of disruption that China is intent on?
Well, I'd certainly agree with Dennis that there's a very important lesson we have to learn about the nature of the strategic security threats we face. The bushfires, the pandemics and so on. I mean, that is absolutely right. To conceive national security in the narrow military terms that we have traditionally done is a big mistake. But I also think it's a mistake to imagine that because we become more conscious, more responsive to those new threats, the old threats have gone away. We have lived through a few decades in which major conflict has been extremely rare. But that's not because of some fundamental change in the nature of the international system or in human nature. It's just been because the way the world has worked. And what we're seeing now as a rivalry between the US and China escalates, for that matter, as a rivalry between Russia and the United States, we're seeing a return to precisely the kinds of conditions, the kinds of power politics, which in the past have produced really major conflicts. So I think when we ask ourselves, do we need to prepare for the old-fashioned wars as well as these other kinds of national security threats? I think the answer is yes, we do, because the way in which the world is moving is making that less unlikely. I also think I absolutely agree with Dennis that putting a much bigger effort into framing our relationships with countries in our region is terribly important. But I think we'd be too optimistic to imagine that that's going to provide an easy, assured path to a peaceful and stable region. What I fear is that China actually has a pretty good chance, notwithstanding the many problems it faces, of establishing itself as the dominant power, at least in East Asia. And that will be a very different world for Australia. Ever since the Europeans settled this continent, we have always had either Britain or America as the dominant power in our part of the world. And that's been very comfortable for us. So I think we're still a long way from preparing ourselves for what it's going to be like to live in a region which is, I think, most likely to be dominated by a very different kind of country.
Can I ask you?
Paul, could I just add something to that too? I mean,
yeah,
China is not just seeking that that hegemony, regional hegemony, but is also putting its money into defending that. It now accounts for 70% of total spend throughout the entirety of East Asia, total military spend. 70% of that comes from China. I wouldn't be so sanguine on the idea that you don't have an old-fashioned bombing of Darwin or war on the ground either, because I've covered these wars. They look exactly the same as wars of the past. I've been in Syria, I've been in Iraq, I've been in Afghanistan, you know, a dead body, explosions in marketplaces, bombings still happen. And I think we're foolish to think that it can't still happen here. There's war in cyberspace. Many have said that that's where, you know, World War III, if we're talking about it, begins. But it begins potentially in something like cyberspace. So I think those threats are still there and they're very real. And it isn't, Dennis is right, it is not just the United States and China, but there's also China and India. They fought wars in the past, and just a month ago, there they were eyeballing each other across disputed border. There's North Korea and South Korea. There's Pakistan and India. There's Japan and China. There's the various tripwires of the South China Sea. All of these things not handled properly or escalating can very quickly lead to conflict, and very, very bloody conflict on the ground as well.
Yeah,
I'm not denying that bloody conflict's possible. In fact, I mean, as you say, Stan, we're living through examples of bloody conflict. All I'm asking really is, do we imagine some sort of direct military attack of that would somehow have to imply what happens to all the countries between China and Australia? Are we suggesting a replay of World War II, which is what sounds to me like?
I'd like to hear you on that. How do you see that? Is that what you see, the type of replay of that sort of regional conflict, island to island, nation to nation?
Well, no, I would have thought, well, I mean, Hugh knows more about this than I do, but I would have thought that the way China will exert its influence and its pressure, with the exception of an attack on Taiwan, which I think is a real possibility, is going to be through the use of cyberspace, the use of economic pressures. I think they're going to be very powerful, and I think we need ways of meeting those. All I'm suggesting is that they're not going to be traditional military type attacks, and that there is a danger in a lot of the popular rhetoric that somehow seems to be going back. You know, I think it was Dean Rusk who mused on the fact that when the US was losing tortured war in Vietnam, he mused on the fact that generals always fight the last war. I think there's a bit of a tendency in the Australian media today to be doing that.
Hugh?
Well, look, I think we have to be very careful to remember that the kind of world we're looking at in the decades to come, the kind of world in which this question will be answered, is going to look very different from the world we've known. We have lived through decades in which the use of force by China in that kind of way has seemed simply unthinkable. But if we think about a world in which China is a dominant power in East Asia, in which it seeks to exercise its influence over the regions in what it will regard as its sphere of influence, then I think the idea that armed force against other countries will be one of the instruments of policy that it will choose, I don't think that's ruled out. Look at the way America behaves in the Western Hemisphere. America has been the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere for a couple of hundred years. And although it doesn't always use armed force, in fact, it often uses those other instruments of policy, the old equivalents of the economic and cyber pressure that Dennis mentioned. When push came to shove, America has always been willing to use armed force in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's not a bad model. We're going to live in a region in which I think most likely China is going to be the dominant power, is going to seek to assert its position, and if countries can't be brought to heel in other ways, they will look at using armed force to do so. There's a question for us then as to how seriously we want to take that risk and whether or not we're prepared to do what's required to make that harder for China, to raise the threshold for China in doing that.
Hugh, if COVID-19 is reshaping and changing our relationship with China, how is it also reshaping our relationship with the United States, which all three of you have pretty much acknowledged is a seriously weakened United States with really a dysfunctional level of governance at the moment?
Well, I think our relationship with the United States is in a great moment of flux and crisis at the moment because there are two contradictory trends underway. The first is that as China becomes more powerful and more threatening, there's been a very strong inclination in Australia to depend more on the United States. And in many ways, I think Australians, including Australian political leaders and policy leaders, are more willing to depend on the United States today than they have been for decades in the past. On the other hand, there's an acknowledgement that the United States is becoming weaker and less reliable and less credible as an ally. And I think there's a real sort of uncertainty, and you can see this in the government's new Defence Strategic Update published last week. That on one hand, we talk up how important it is to rely on the United States, and then other parts of the document talk about how we have to focus instead on depending more on the region or standing more by ourselves. Now, my own view is that the United States is going to be a lot less reliable in future than it has been in the past. I think the United States is facing a truly historic challenge from China. It's not that China is going to rule the world, but I think China has so many advantages of the home team in competing with America for the strategic primacy in East Asia that America's chance of really sustaining its position or even sustaining any strong strategic role in Asia at all is pretty low. And that's very traumatic for Australia.
It's particularly traumatic, Hugh, if simultaneously you see a weakening of the economic relationship with China and Australia. You have the worst of both worlds. You have an ally in the United States that you can no longer rely on for your security, and you have a regional trading partner who you can no longer rely on for your wealth.
That is exactly right. This is a very grim model for Australia. I mean, for the past 20 or 30 years, we've relied on China to make us rich and America to keep us safe, and it's all worked pretty well. We have been a lucky country, and we're in serious danger of both of those going astray. I mean, you asked Stan before about the question of does Australia have to choose between America and China? In fact, I think he's right. To frame, we're making those choices all the time, but to frame it in that way is oversimplifying, because the real risk for us is that if we choose to side with America, we won't get the security we hope for because America won't be there for us. And so, it's a much more delicate balancing act than simply flopping to one side or the other.
Yeah, Stan, the old argument about Australia untethering itself from ANZUS was really about the fact that, perhaps Australia should not be a party to US hegemony. It would seem the new argument is a much more pragmatic one about, can we continue to rely on the US to provide us with the security that they have in the past?
Yeah, and I don't think anyone's talking about tearing up ANZUS, but the United States is still, worth remembering, is still by a significant margin, the most powerful military in the world, the most powerful military the world's ever known. Officially, its defence spending is something in the order of 4 times what China spends, although we don't know totally what China spends because a lot of it is hidden. But what we have seen is the limits of that power and the limits of that military might. That the most powerful military the world has ever seen has been bogged down in places like Afghanistan, places like the Middle East, that a military solution to winning hearts and minds, or the Iraq experience of going in and upending a dictatorship and thinking that democracy simply would flourish there and you'd have this flowering of democracy throughout the Middle East. It doesn't work that way. And when you are bogged down and when you are involved in being a policeman or involved in nation building, this saps you of blood, it saps you of treasure, it saps you of energy, and the damage to American prestige is something that we have to take into account. But again, I wouldn't be saying it is, America's on the way out and China is just on the rise. There are many things that complicate that picture. And one thing I'd be really interested in Dennis, actually, who would know more about this than I, but I've been thinking a lot about this. Part of the rise of China has been, and not just China, but the increasing power of countries like India as well, has been to incorporate them into a global order that is still Eurocentric. You still have the World Bank and the IMF controlled by Europe, controlled by the United States. There are multilateral organizations where China and India and other rising powers are not given a voice, not given a say. I think we need to explore that as well in ways of being able to bring China into a global order that doesn't tear up the global order, upset that order. There is still a lot of work for diplomacy and proper management of global affairs to be done. But the thing I was wondering from Dennis was whether we are getting to the point where we're losing that opportunity.
Look, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that Australian foreign policy, in its desire to constantly follow the lead of the United States, has often made some extraordinary decisions that put us less and less on side with countries in the region. I mean, take, for example, the off-the-cuff suggestion by the Prime Minister, again, interestingly, because of a by-election, to move the Australian embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The only people who liked that were the right-wing forces in Israel and the evangelical and Israeli lobby in the United States. It went down extremely badly. It hurt relations with countries that actually matter to us a lot more, such as Indonesia and Malaysia. But Stan, can I just go back to the first point you made? Because if in fact, I mean, I agree with you entirely that the United States, with all its military power, bogged down and has been unable to be successful in a whole series of interventions, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Why do we not assume that China will have the same experience, that if in fact it does increase its military expenditure, as it is, if it starts engaging in military adventures, which it might, will it not inevitably, perhaps, come to the same conclusion that the United States has come to? In fact, I suspect the Chinese have watched the United States very carefully and are very aware of the traps. So I think that, again, I don't think that the military rise of China necessarily means the implications that Hugh sees it. I do think, and I think we all agree, it is in Australia's interests, far more than it's in the interests of a great power. It's in our interests to have strong global institutions. And if that means we take a line that is not popular with either Beijing or Washington, that seems to me perfectly okay and may in fact make it a lot easier for us to work with countries in the region.
Hugh, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, look, thanks, Paul. They're a really important set of points. I'd say two things. The first is on Dennis's last point. I absolutely agree. As a middle power, at best, maybe even only a small power, we do need strong global institutions, but I think we need to recognise that strong global institutions in the end depend on the relationships between the great powers. Very hard to build a global institution, frame global institutions without the world's strongest states going along. And so the chances of us being able to build middle power coalitions that can overrule the great powers are pretty low. It's a matter of working with the great powers and seeing how well we can get on. The second point relates to the military balance between the US and China. Of course, America has an enormously strong military. And if you look at the list of stuff they've got, it's longer. They've got a longer list of stuff than anybody else. I think that's a mistaken way of looking at armed force. What matters with armed force is not what you got, but what you can do with it where it matters. Mm-hmm. And in the military contest between America and China, that is a contest in the Western Pacific. If we were talking about a contest in the Caribbean, America would win it. There's no question. But in the Western Pacific, China has immense advantages. Above all, it has the advantage that America has to project power by sea across the Pacific into the Western Pacific. China can operate from its own mainland bases. And because of the balance in military technologies, which have been shifting actually very steadily for a century now, but very quickly in the last couple of decades, projecting power by sea has become harder and harder. So I think, although it's true that America's still got more stuff and still spends more, I think China has long passed the point where it can deprive the United States of an opportunity to win a conventional war in the Western Pacific. And that one of the reasons why I think America's prospects in Asia is so grim is that the costs and risks to the United States of a military confrontation with China over something like Taiwan, for example, are now very high indeed. And one of the implications of that is that if neither side can win a decisive victory in conventional terms, the risk of escalation to a nuclear exchange is very high. One of the things that worries me is that people talk about escalating rivalry between the US and China without remembering that these are both nuclear powers. They could fight a nuclear war. And I personally think that the threshold for nuclear escalation between the two of them in an Asian conflict is quite low. And that's a very good reason to put a lot of effort into focusing on how do you prevent that war happening.
Okay, we're looking really at the pandemic and how it's exposed some currents geopolitically, exacerbated some tensions, highlighted some others. And Stan, to that end, I wanted to look at the Black Lives Matter movement. Has the emergence of this enormous campaign that has spread globally now, in the midst of a pandemic that the US is unable to control, has all of this been a coincidence that it's come forward at this particular moment in time?
No, not a coincidence at all. I think this is part of the unravelling of that sort of neoliberal experiment. As we saw damage with 9/11, war, 2008, global financial crisis, and the return of politics. You know, the neoliberal experiment was the elevation of economics over politics. You know, as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. It's economics with a bit of ethics and a bit of public morality, but not a contestation, a political contestation that we're seeing, I think, much more within democracies now. And that's increasing the tribalism and political polarization, the left to the right, that cuts across so many different areas, and the rise of what we see as an identity politics. And who plays that identity politics? Certainly the white right of America plays that identity politics. It was there at the heart of the Brexit decision. It's part of the rise of the far right across Europe, and it's also part of the colour line and the unresolved questions of history. I think we're seeing, again, something I come back to that I mused on earlier, and that is this idea about how fit liberal democracy is in its weakened state, in its economically weakened state. Coronavirus has exposed a lot of that vulnerability, how effective it is in governing over diversity, governing over difference, and dealing with the unresolved legacy of its own history. You know, liberalism as an idea is a progressive idea that moves on history, that you leave these things behind and create a politically neutral space where we can all give and take. But of course, we don't come to that space equally. And I think Black Lives Matter plays into this contest of politics, identity, unresolved issues of history, and this is the inflammable mix of our democracies right now. So I think it does play into this. I think it is important that it's happening right now, and it's forcing all of us to reflect on what it is to live in a liberal democracy, in a pluralist liberal democracy, to deal with these unresolved issues of the past. Everything is in the mix now. It's class, it's race, it's statues, it's politics, all of these of this mix, and often very incendiary mix. So yes, I would place Black Lives Matter at the heart of that.
Yeah, Dennis, I can see you nodding there. Would you like to add to Stan?
I just wanted to add that, of course, a lot of the anger is furthered by the reality in the United States that the impact of the epidemic has been far greater on Americans and Latino Americans than it has on white Americans. And that's really just to suggest there is a clear connection. I think that many of the people in the United States who are angry, who are out in the streets, are angry and out in the streets because of centuries of abuse, but also because of an immediate situation where the social fabric of the country is unable to provide them with protection. And, you know, the sad thing is we're seeing echoes of this now in Australia. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, where we have just locked down very severely major housing commission dwellings. Now, there are strong arguments for the lockdown that I don't want to go into here, but the reality is those are places where the populations are extremely diverse, include very many newly arrived immigrants, people who have little access to social wealth, social goods. And the danger, I think, is that the images of the police, those tower blocks, the feeling that it was possible to do it there in a way we couldn't do it when it was well-off, affluent Australians coming back from ski holidays, that's clearly going to linger and I think make social divisions in this country more difficult.
Paul, can I just add to that as well, is that Australia is not immune from this. You know, we saw Scott Morrison saying that we shouldn't import these issues. Well, those issues of racial equality, history, the legacy of history, are our issues as well. I think when he talks about, every time questions of history are raised, that Indigenous people seek to speak the truth of the Indigenous experience in Australia, it's always framed as a history war, as if it's somehow an attack on Australia. And I think the failure of our politics to deal with the legitimate political claims of Indigenous people to autonomy and some measure of self-determination, best, I think, represented by the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was a fundamentally modest conservative idea that said within the Constitution of Australia, Indigenous people should have a voice that at least seeks to influence policy directed towards them. For the rejection of that also undermined the strength of our own democracy. Yeah. Democracy should be able to govern over difference. It should be able to accommodate the rights of groups within it. It should be able to deal with the legacy of history. But every time we frame it as being something that is exclusive, an attack on the state, illiberal, we do damage to our democracy.
Yeah. Another interesting issue out of this, Hugh, is, and Dennis alluded to it before, I mean, you've had the situation that part of the reason that China has been able to effectively deal with the pandemic at home is because it's an authoritarian country. It can pretty much do what it likes. We've just seen in Victoria, as we've heard, a democratic government resorting to an almost authoritarian response, sending the police in to lock down apartment buildings to control the pandemic. Now, these tactics may be justifiable in terms of controlling the pandemic, but they do seem to resemble something that China might do, indeed something that China might also argue is justifiable. It's a kind of irony, isn't it, at a time where we're seeing this conflict between democratic and authoritarian values play out, that one of the tools in our toolkit that seems to be most used at the moment is an authoritarian tactic to control the pandemic at home.
No, look, I think that's exactly right, Paul. I mean, one of the big challenges here is that it's very tempting for us to frame our conversation about China in terms of China being a country with completely different values from ours reflected in their different political system. But in fact, all societies, when they face what they feel to be serious challenges to their well-being, bring out their authoritarian side. I mean, we've seen the passage of laws since 9/11. We've seen the passage of laws in Australia empowering ASIO, which back in the 90s would not have been contemplated. I think we've gone too far on that. And now we're seeing actions like the actions that Dennis was referring to, those very unsettling images of the use of the police in those roles, the closure of the Victoria-New South Wales borders. These are measures which we would have regarded as unthinkable. And so it's just worth remembering, not to say that there aren't important differences between Australia and China, but all societies make their own decisions about how they're going to use the state power to achieve their objectives. And I think it helps us to remember that, not to overemphasise the differences between Australian values, for example, and Chinese values. John Howard's not always a political leader, I'm inclined to quote, but he did have a line that says, let's focus on the things that unite us rather than the things that divide us. He often didn't live by that himself, but as a principle, it's not a bad one.
Yeah. Stan, closing international borders has, of course, also wrought havoc, on the economy in Australia, education, tourism, dependent on international visitors, and who knows when we're going to see that returning to anything near normal. We've kind of picked a bit of a fight with China too in Australia with some of our diplomatic exchanges. What do you think the economic cost of this is likely to be in Australia? It's not something that we've spoken about yet in this discussion, but it's going to be profound, isn't it?
Already is. We're now in recession. This 30-year miracle of unending economic growth that we were so proud of. We'd seen off the 97 Asia financial crisis. We'd seen off the worst of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We had money in the bank then that we could use to stimulate the economy. Now we've had to go into debt. We've brought an end to that unending growth. This is a new world. There's a lot of talk now about creating new streams, new economic streams, looking at diversifying our supply chain, paying more attention to countries such as India, moving away from China. But India's economy is nowhere near China's. I mean, China's economy still is, by some measures, the biggest economy in the world, or on track to become the biggest economy in the world. So looking for alternatives to China is not going to be easy. What I worry about too, Paul, is the impact this is having on those people who are now losing their jobs who will never work again. We know that people in their 50s who lose jobs during a recession often never come back into the workplace. Yeah. And I worry about the young. I worry about people who have already lost faith in our politics, in our institutions, in our democracy. There was a Lowy Institute poll not that long ago which said that, many young people simply don't believe in democracy anymore. They don't believe they're going to be able to buy a house. They work in the gig economy. They can't be assured of superannuation. They can't be assured of proper health care. And I really worry about the impact on these people who are going to have to shoulder the burden of this debt and live through a recession that we don't know how long or how deep it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a moment in time, Dennis, isn't it, for dealing with some of those economic shifts that have occurred over the years. I mean, both in terms of our reliance on China, but also some of the industrial relations changes that have entrenched themselves in Australia, like the large number of people, young people, women especially, in casual employment. The pandemic's really focused on that, hasn't it?
Well, look, if we look at the major export earnings of Australia before the pandemic, they were led by our export of raw materials. We're very good at digging up raw materials and sending them, and China has been a very willing recipient of those raw materials. But after the export of iron ore and coal comes international students who brought into the country in vast numbers, often in extraordinary executive ways, and international tourism. Clear that neither of those are going to go back to pre-COVID levels for some time, if ever. I mean, my hunch is that the number of Chinese students who will be willing to come or will be able to come and study in Australia is never going to regain the figures we saw a year ago. So the implications, and I totally agree with Stan, I mean, there are major implications not just for the people who are currently unemployed, but major repercussions for some of the structures we have. The entire university sector will need to rethink in very drastic ways in a situation where we have a government that seems remarkably disinterested in the future of universities. The collapse of international tourism, I don't think it will come back in time to save small businesses in those parts of the country that have been essentially dependent upon international tourism. So, I don't want to say I'm with Stan. I share Stan's pessimism. I am with Stan in that sense. I think it would be silly to deny that there are going to be some very major shocks, and they're going to be long-term shocks. And nobody at this stage, I think, has very good answers to how we deal with them.
Yeah. If I can come to you, Hugh, you've also been a part of the university system for a long time. I have a lot to do for a variety of reasons with universities, with university academics, and have had conversations with university administrators. And the interesting thing is that many of the administrators that I have spoken to in years gone by were painfully aware of their vulnerability in terms of being exposed to China and exposed to a decline in Chinese students. I don't think they were predicting a pandemic, but they did have in the back of their mind something else that could have led to a sharp fall in international students, yet there was nothing they do about it. It strikes me that in a way the university sector is a microcosm of the economy as a whole in that respect. I mean, there's all of this talk about diversifying our trading partners, but how do you replace China?
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. I mean, going back to a point that Stan made, the idea that we're too dependent on China and therefore we should just start selling 1 million tonnes of iron ore a day to somebody else. Nobody else uses iron ore in those sorts of quantities. So I think, although of course we should diversify, I think we should be very realistic about how hard that's going to be. And on the student issue, look, I think you're absolutely right. The fact is that Australia as a whole, not just the tertiary sector, that Australia as a whole has made a choice that we want to fund our tertiary education through education exports. We could have chosen to have higher fees. We could have chosen to have more government support for universities, but instead we chose to pay for our university system by getting the parents in other countries to pay for it. And that's worked pretty well for us for the last decade or two, but the pandemic has absolutely exposed the vulnerability of that. And so we're going to have to go back and rethink the foundations of our tertiary education system. And I think there's no sign at all the government understands how serious this is. Because I completely agree with Dennis, we're not going to see those students come back, and we are either going to see a very sharp decline in the quality of our tertiary education, or we're going to have to go back and rethink the model from the ground up. And I personally think that that's going to be one of the most important things to our economic future. We have no model for what our economy looks like when we're no longer selling as much iron ore to China, and we're no longer selling as much tourism and education overseas. But education has got to be at the heart of building that new economy, and universities have got to be at the heart of that. And so nothing is more important to our future than getting that right.
It's curious, isn't it, Dennis, that the government hasn't used this opportunity to really have a look at root and branch reform of the university system, because it's been a long time since it's done so, and a lot of the changes have been rather ad hoc over the past decade or two.
I think the government, the current government, and to be fair, I think previous Labor governments have had a whole set of grievances about the university sector that I think has meant it's been very difficult for them to go beyond the immediate, often punitive financial measures. I think that this was most evident in the way that the government changed legislation several times to prevent universities using JobKeeper in the current situation. Now, whether there is somewhere in either party, because I don't see it in Labor at the moment, a willingness to actually do what Hugh has said, and Hugh is right, to rethink how we fund tertiary education in Australia, which has to also include technical education, and there will be an increasing need for technical education as immigration decline. I'm pessimistic, as I say, about either side of politics having the desire and the wit to do this. Now, in a sense, I think one can also say the universities have failed. The leaders of the universities have been, I think, too preoccupied to present themselves as running efficient corporate-like structures. A lot of money has gone on building glamorous buildings, on increasing by absolute numbers senior management, by spending a lot of money on promotions, buying slogans. In Melbourne, buying the sides of trams to advertise one university as against another, even though nobody has ever shown me any evidence that somebody enrolls in a university because they see its slogan on a tram. So I think universities have to take some responsibility for this. And what I would like to see, and maybe, you know, sometimes disasters force people into new avenues, maybe some genuine coming together of the political and the academic leadership can do what Hugh says, and Hugh rightly says we need to do, which is to rethink how the university sector in Australia can best function into the coming decades.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. We've spent a lot of time on Big Ideas talking about this. I think it's a really important national challenge. Stan, if I can come to you, just Dennis has mentioned a couple of times throughout this discussion about the fall in immigration to Australia. The skilled migration program has been suspended, and net intake of immigrants, I think, will fall by 85% this financial year. And Australia is a nation that has been built on immigration. It's also a country that's, you know, had to deal with race and xenophobia, as well, as you well know. What do you think the impact, the psychological impact, as much as the economic impact, will be of this fall in immigration?
I think the psychological impact is really important, and I think it's not just Australia, but if you look at the wave of political populism that we've seen in places across Europe is directly linked to a blowback against immigration, particularly a blowback against refugees, targeting various groups within the society as being people who don't share the values of that society. You know, populism, which divides people into an us and a them, the real people and the non-people. Who has the narrative? Who controls the narrative of the nation? I think these things are really critical. Australia's been protected from some of the political extremes because of our political system, particularly having compulsory voting, which does inoculate us to a degree against some of the more extremes of populism. But you do have to worry about the psychological impact of decreasing immigration. But beyond that, a narrative in the country, we've seen this already, and Dennis touched on this earlier, that isolates and identifies particular groups as doing harm to us, that the people locked up in the towers now are not us. We've heard that from Pauline Hanson already. Now, I know Pauline Hanson is an outlier, but it's not long before what Pauline Hanson says today is repeated by some of the more respectable politicians tomorrow, because it leads to votes, because it touches on those hot issues of race. Australia is a deeply unprincipled nation when it comes to issues of race, whether it's the White Australia policy, the colonisation, invasion and treatment of First Nations people, the failure to deal with the legacy of that history. We have deep problems in the country when it comes to those issues. And if this feeds into a narrative, a populist narrative of us versus them, of targeting people, of identifying people as not just different to us, but a threat to us, that's what we're seeing already with the narrative around coronavirus.
Dennis, do you want to respond to that?
Well, look, I agree strongly with Stan. I mean, I think there is this immediate question, not just of opposition to immigration, but the reality that large-scale immigration has been at least temporarily halted. A lot of the economic growth of Australia over the last few decades has been very closely linked to large-scale immigration. I think we're going to see, therefore, an economic problem over the next few years. Now, interestingly, the opposition to immigrants that Stan talks about, that's been a major feature in Europe, has not really been a big issue in Australia. There's been a lot of demonisation of refugees. There's been appalling treatment of asylum seekers. But throughout the period, there's been bipartisan agreement on large-scale immigration. Whether that agreement will persist years after the pandemic, if we can talk about years after the pandemic, because we don't know how long we're going to be living with it, at a time when the economy is in trouble, when unemployment figures are high, this could lead to a permanent downgrading of immigration into this country, which in turn has all sorts of implications, economic implications, psychological implications, and of course very deep and hurtful personal implications for a lot of people who now live in Australia, who are seeking family reunion. Families have been divided by this epidemic. People are scattered across the world, unable to be together. And there's a human side to this, which is too easy to forget when we talk about the aggregate numbers and the figures. But I think that in addition to all the problems, as I say, that Stan talks about of Australia's very deep inability to deal with its own history, to deal with the ongoing racist attitudes that so many of us have, there's the immediate issue of what does it mean for a country that has embraced large-scale immigration to turn off the tap? And we respond to that over the next few years.
And Hugh, just related to that, Hong Kong may be about to experience an exodus of citizens as a result of China imposing its new repressive laws over that country. And I think I'm correct in saying that Australia has said it will accept generous numbers of Hong Kong refugees, which is rather reminiscent to the Tiananmen Square situation. Is it fair enough that we do so, that we provide generous asylum to Hong Kong refugees?
Well, you're right. The government has, as I understand it, indicated at least a willingness to consider that, following on from the British decision to make generous provision for Hong Kong people wanting to leave. Look, I think that's a very complicated question. Part of it is that it will have implications for our relationship with China. And people like to say that this is a matter of our values and our values are non-negotiable, but actually international relations are never quite that easy. The second is it does go to the question of the way we run our immigration program. The idea that we'd accept hundreds of thousands of people from Hong Kong, but have been so absurdly parsimonious about our willingness to accept refugees from other parts of the world would at least raise some questions about consistency. But there's also a third element here, which I think is very important, and it touches on some of the points that Stan was making earlier. Because not just does Australia have trouble with racism in relation to First Nations, there's also a long history of racism towards Asians, which is, very deeply embedded in the old Australian psyche, the white Australia years. And there is, to my mind, a worrying question about how Australian attitudes, particularly to our Chinese Australian citizens, evolves as our attitudes to China evolve. And the more we see China as an adversary, the more we see China as a threat, and it's very much now government policy to describe it as that, must have implications for the way Australians see Australian of Chinese origins. Now, I do think one of the really central things for us over the years to come is to remember that 1 million and more Australians of Chinese origin are a massive asset for us in dealing with China, not a liability. But that's going to be a message which is going to require a lot of stressing over the years to come, because the temptations to push the other way, I think, are going to be real and are going to grow.
Yeah. Look, just looking at the time, we are pretty much out of time. We've spoken about many of the pressure points and challenges that the pandemic has at least thrown the spotlight on and perhaps exacerbated. And I have to say, it has in part been a rather bleak conversation. So I thought I'd leave us. Let's leave us with, can any of you think of anything that may come out of this pandemic that may result in some positive change, some positive self-reflection, something that you can leave us with that gives us at least a modicum of hope? Dennis, I'll let you have a crack at that one first of all.
I think that one thing that this epidemic has done is reinforced a willingness to trust expertise. And it's been interesting to see the way in which health authority has been strengthened. And you see it, most dramatically, I guess, in the United States, where I'm sure that Dr. Fauci could be elected president immediately nominated. But we see it as well in Australia. And I think that is in an era when there has been a lot of criticism, a lot of populist blowback against expertise. That, to me, is a positive sign.
Okay. Stan?
I think even looking at my own family life during this period, when you're living in closer quarters, you can, ideally be kinder to each other. You can, one of the things I've been really pleased with is seeing how my boys who are all studying and living at home, they've started a podcast. They've started doing things at home because they didn't have the freedom to go out with their mates and do what they were normally doing. So that's been good. But I would also say, Paul, I don't necessarily think this has been a bleak conversation. I think the political agitation we're seeing in the world is a good thing. I think Black Lives Matter is a good thing.
Indeed.
I think that the participation in our politics that we are seeing is a good thing. And I think focusing our minds now, after what was a very long post-Cold War slumber, the end of history idea that all these things were settled, that we are focusing our minds now on China and how we incorporate China or not, and where that may lead us. I think that is good. I think we are in an interesting place, a potentially dangerous place, but a place that is exercising our minds.
Yes, no longer sleepwalking, perhaps. Hugh?
Well, I do think most of the news is gloomy, I should be honest about that, but I'd pick up 2 points. The first is that I think it does give us an opportunity, this really picked up the point that Stan was making, to revitalise our political leadership. We've seen our political leaders do the kind of thing they haven't done for a while. And although they've done it with varying degrees of success, I think overall it's reminded one of how important political leadership is and how it can work when it works well. And the other thing is, picking up on Dennis's point, I think that the return to respect for expertise is very important, and it makes me modestly hopeful that we might restart the debate on climate change. It's been very striking to me that politicians who said that they would never jeopardise Australia's economy in order to respond to the challenges of climate change, have been prepared to trash Australia's economy in order to respond to the challenges of the pandemic. And, you know, they just ignored the scientific evidence on the one and revered the scientific evidence on the other. So I have a modest hope that when this is over, or at least further progressed, it'll allow us to return to the climate change question.
Well, look, thank you very much, Hugh White, Stan Grant and Dennis Altman. Wonderfully stimulating discussion. I want to thank the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre at the University of South Australia and The Conversation for putting this on. I'm Paul Barclay from Big Ideas on Radio National. This conversation will be broadcast on my radio program in the weeks to come. Thanks for joining us, and bye for now.